The opening line of today's gospel says that the rulers sneered at Jesus. I think it's just as true today as it was on the day of Jesus' crucifixion. Maybe their sneering is not so blatant, maybe their sneering isn't so obvious, but there is an outright rejection of the kind of power, the kind of authority, the kind of authenticity, and the model of service that Jesus gives to kingship, to authority, to leadership, and to power. When Pope Pius XI established this feast of Jesus Christ the King in 1925, he did it precisely because there was a surge of nationalism going on throughout Europe. There was a reclaiming of people's heritage and their ethnic identity, which is not a bad thing in itself. But when it becomes a superiority issue, and when it becomes one of putting down other people's, when it becomes one of establishing one's race, one's ethnicity, one's inheritance, one's bloodline as being dominant and legitimating the destruction of others, it's an outright rejection of the kingdom of God, an outright rejection of all that Jesus stands for and taught. It bothered Pope Pius that even Christians, even in very Catholic countries, people were buying into the values of the world around them and were joining in this kind of ugly nationalism that rejected others and even led to persecution, eventually to the Holocaust, led to the destruction of entire peoples. Pius XI wanted to remind Christians that from the day of our baptism, we belong to another kingdom. And our loyalty has to be, if our baptism is genuine and authentic, our loyalty has to be to the kingdom of God, and that is inevitably going to clash with the power systems and the kingdoms of this world. Pius XI himself, when he was elected Pope in 1922, and when he stepped out on the balcony of St. Peter's to bless the crowds, it marked the first time in more than 50 years that people had seen a pope. Hard to imagine in our very visual age. Hard to imagine in our time of instant news and constant news feeds and 24-hour news cycles. But for more than 50 years, nobody had seen a picture, an image, nobody had seen the Pope in public. It's because in 1870, with the unification of Italy and the foundation of that modern nation, and with the changes that were going on in power struggles all across Europe, the Pope became what he called a prisoner of the Vatican. Now, before that, the Pope had been like a king himself, and until fairly recently, popes wore a triple crown. It was supposed to represent the three structures, the three levels of authority that were given them to teach, to sanctify, and to govern. But too often in our history, they ruled like kings. They ruled like worldly authorities rather than the spiritual authorities that they were meant to be. And so the church lost what was called the Papal States and consolidated its territory into the small city-state known as the Vatican today. But it was that Pope who stepped out on the balcony who realized that this was an opportunity to reclaim it all for Christ the King, and to remind people, whatever country, whatever kingdom, whatever principality, whatever nation they lived in, that because of baptism, we belong to a kingdom that is not of this world, just like Jesus told Pontius Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." And they sneered at Jesus. They didn't know what to do with that kind of authority. They didn't know what to do with that kind of power. The reality is they would have been much more comfortable with the kind of power with which Satan tempted Jesus right after his baptism and before his public ministry. When Satan wanted Jesus to use his authority to turn stones into bread, to jump off the pinnacle of the temple and be caught by angels, to do great shows of power, great shows of influence, and then to bow down before him. And Jesus understood very clearly that it would have been an easier route, but it would have undermined his whole purpose, his whole mission, his reason for coming into the world to save us, by his willingness to show us a love that is stronger than death, a love that is willing to accept suffering and rejection, a love that keeps on loving no matter what the world and no matter what the inhabitants of the world give to him. And he demonstrated this on the cross, his most genuine act of kingship. What to all the world looked like complete powerlessness, fragility, and brokenness was actually a sign of a power that is beyond our ability to grasp. Shortly after Pope Pius XI established this feast for the whole church, it took on a particular significance in Mexico, at a time when the government there in that very Catholic country was officially atheist, and it was outlawed to have the symbols of the Catholic faith, to have novitiates and professions of religious life, to have ordinations to the priesthood, and in many places to even celebrate the sacraments. It all became illegal. There rose up in the center of Mexico a movement called the Cristero movement that decided they had to resist this form of government and pledge their allegiance to Christ, the universal King. 25 martyrs, 25 saints were added to our calendar by Pope John Paul II, recognizing those Cristeros that stood up and paid the ultimate price. Priests, lay people, catechists, religious were put to death for doing what we take for granted week after week, but we sometimes don't even recognize the significance of, because they were willing to celebrate the forgiveness of sins and the sacrament of reconciliation, because they were willing to celebrate the Eucharist and give people the life-giving and nourishing body and blood of Christ, because they were willing to continue to teach about a kingdom that is not of this world. They were brought before firing squads and put to death, one as young as 14 years old. Last night I had the privilege of being with 20,000 youth from across the country in Lucas Oil Stadium, and see that stadium, that shrine to sports, be filled with people worshiping the universal King. On Friday night, 20,000 young people, 20,000 teenagers were on their knees in that stadium before the Blessed Sacrament in silence. How long do you think silence can last with 20,000 teenagers? But they realized there was something incredible going on, but something that's so incredible it can be experienced on a regular basis. We have a chapel just right over there where our Eucharistic Lord, where our Christ, the universal King, is present 24 hours a day, anxious to hear us, anxious to receive our prayers, our worship, our adoration, our thanksgiving, and anxious to accompany us, to remind us of the values that are beyond this world. It was so powerful to see those young people reawakening in their faith and feeling and experiencing the nearness and the presence of Jesus, who is at the same time Almighty King, as St. Paul described in that second letter, the beginning and end of everything, and at the same time the brother, the friend, the humble shepherd, the person who is willing to be ridiculed and sneered at, the one who gave his life for us. This liturgical year, we've been hearing from the Gospel of St. Luke. And St. Luke goes out of his way to demonstrate Jesus' inclusion in his kingdom of those that the world excludes. That Jesus' demonstrations of power and authority are always for the good of the outcast, for the good of the hungry, for the good of the thirsty, for the good of the naked, for the good of the excluded. Jesus' life on this earth began that way, as we will commemorate in just a few weeks, being born and placed in a manger because there was no room in the inn, among the homeless, among the rejected, among the outcast, and among the poor from the very beginning of his life among us. And as the gospel proclaims today, crucified between two thieves, while the world and the world's powers made fun, ridiculed, jeered at him. And what was the ridicule? What was the taunt that even one of the thieves made towards Jesus? The soldiers, the powerful ones, those who rejected his message, what was their taunt? If you're so powerful, get down from there. Or as one of the thieves said, save yourself and us. He did save them and us. But what if Jesus had gotten down from the cross? One of those cristeros that was martyred and then canonized by the church wrote a poem about that in Spanish. What if Jesus had come down from the cross? What if Jesus had just decided to save himself and show his power and rub it in the face of those soldiers who nailed him there and all those people who rejected him? What if he just wielded power in the way that we're used to it? We wouldn't be here today worshiping him. We wouldn't be here today with the hope of salvation. We wouldn't be here today with the idea that we too can serve one another and participate in a love that is stronger than even death itself. Jesus very well could have gotten down from that cross, and the story would have ended there, and it would be a forgotten chapter in history. But Jesus shows power by letting us do our worst, by letting the world do its worst, by letting the rejection of the world have its most complete illusion of power, and accepting all of that in love, and then coming back from the dead, not with vengeance, but proclaiming a mercy that is without end. As we've been hearing the values of the kingdom of God from St. Luke all year, it's not surprising that it's only Luke's gospel that contains the passage from the crucifixion that we heard today, about the conversation between Jesus and the thief at his side, who chastises the other thief who joins in the ridicule and says, we got what we deserve, but this man is innocent. And then he says a prayer which should be on the lips of every one of us as we celebrate this feast. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And for Jesus to remember us when he comes into his kingdom suggests that we should remember Jesus when we give so much credence, when we give so much power, when we give so much loyalty, when we give so much trust to the kingdoms of this world. Let's remember Jesus and the values of his kingdom. The values of a kingdom that would give a thief the first place because he's repentant. The only person in the Gospels to hear the words, today he will be with me in paradise. If there's hope for that thief who knew that he deserved his punishment, there's certainly hope for all of us. And there's an invitation from the Lord to imitate his service, to love unconditionally, to extend his mercy to others, to recognize that real power is not always where we think it is. It's not contained in those designs of pomp and authority and ostentation. It comes from that humble king, stripped before the world, ridiculed and jeered at, crowned with thorns and nailed to a cross, who can continue to love, continue to demonstrate the unconditional love of his Father. In our cathedral named for Christ the King, we see the images of crowns in our light fixtures, in the molding, in so much of the decorations of this church, but the real image of Christ the King is the one above the altar. It's Christ crucified, demonstrating unconditional love. And then when we leave the church through the main door, we look up at that image of Christ on the throne. It's the same Jesus who experienced that suffering, that same Jesus who experienced that rejection, the same Jesus who experienced that sneering, and who still experiences it today whenever we prefer the values that the world offers us to the values of the kingdom of God. Those martyrs in Mexico, their final words were, Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King. May that echo in our hearts and in our spirits as we celebrate this universal King who humbly laid down his life for us and showed us what real power is all about.